This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kim Zuckert, Tales of the Brass Hedgehog, hedgehog.net. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 56. Georgie is made a gentleman. Georgie Osborne was now fairly established in his grandfather's mansion in Russell Square, occupant of his father's room in the house, and heir apparent of all the splendors there. The good looks, gallant bearing, and gentlemanlike appearance of the boy won the grandsire's heart for him. Mr. Osborne was as proud of him as ever he had been of the elder George. The child had many more luxuries and indulgences than had been awarded his father. Osborne's commerce had prospered greatly of late years. His wealth and importance in the city had very much increased. He had been glad enough in former days to put the elder George to a good private school, and a commission in the army for his son had been a source of no small pride to him. For little George and his future prospects the old man looked much higher. He would make a gentleman of the little chap, was Mr. Osborne's constant saying regarding little Georgie. He saw him in his mind's eye a collegian, a Parliament man, a baronet, perhaps. The old man thought he would die contented if he could see his grandson in a fair way to such honors. He would have none but a tip-top college man to educate him. None of your quacks and pretenders. No, no. A few years before, he used to be savage and inveigh against all parsons, scholars, and the like, declaring that they were a pack of humbugs and quacks that weren't fit to get their living but by grinding Latin and Greek, and a set of supercilious dogs that pretended to look down upon British merchants and gentlemen who could buy up 100 of them. He would mourn now in a very solemn manner that his own education had been neglected, and repeatedly point out in pompous orations to Georgie the necessity and excellence of classical acquirements. When they met at dinner, the grandsire used to ask the lad what he had been reading during the day, and was greatly interested at the report the boy gave of his own studies, pretending to understand little George when he spoke regarding them. He made 100 blunders and showed his ignorance many a time. It did not increase the respect which the child had for his senior. A quick brain and a better education elsewhere showed the boy very soon that his grandsire was a dullard, and he began accordingly to command him and to look down upon him, for his previous education, humble and contracted as it had been, had made a much better gentleman of Georgie than any plans of his grandfather could make him. He had been brought up by a kind, weak, and tender woman, who had no pride about anything but about him, and whose heart was so pure, and whose bearing was so meek and humble, that she could not but needs be a true lady. She busied herself in gentle offices and quiet duties. If she never said brilliant things, she never spoke or thought unkind ones. Guileless and artless, loving and pure, indeed how could our poor little Amelia be other than a real gentlewoman? Young Georgie lorded over this soft and yielding nature, and the contrast of its simplicity and delicacy with the coarse pomposity of the dull old man with whom he next came in contact made him lord over the latter too. If he had been a prince royal, he could not have been better brought up to think well of himself. Whilst his mother was yearning after him at home, and I do believe every hour of the day, and during most hours of the sad, lonely nights, thinking of him, this young gentleman had a number of pleasures and consolations administered to him, which made him, for his part, bear the separation from Amelia very easily. Little boys who cry when they are going to school, cry because they are going to a very uncomfortable place. It is only a few who weep from sheer affection. When you think that the eyes of your childhood dried at the sight of a piece of gingerbread, and that a plum cake was a compensation for the agony of parting with your mamma and sisters, oh, my friend and brother, you need not be too confident of your own fine feelings. Well then, Master George Osborne had every comfort and luxury that a wealthy and lavish old grandfather thought fit to provide. The coachman was instructed to purchase for him the handsomest pony which could be bought for money, and on this George was taught to ride, first at a riding school, whence, after having performed satisfactorily without stirrups and over the leaping bar, he was conducted through the New Road to Regent's Park, and then to Hyde Park, where he rode in state with Martin the coachman behind him. Old Osborne, who took matters more easily in the city now, where he left his affairs to his junior partners, would often ride out with Miss O. in the same fashionable direction. As little Georgie came cantering up with his dandified air and his heels down, his grandfather would nudge the lad's aunt and say, "Look, Miss O," and he would laugh, and his face would grow red with pleasure, as he nodded out the window to the boy, as the groom saluted the carriage, and the footman saluted Master George. Here, too, his aunt, Mrs. Frederick Bullock, whose chariot might daily be seen in the ring, with bullocks emblazoned on the panels and harness, and 3 pasty-faced little bullocks, covered with cockades and feathers, staring out from the windows. Mrs. Frederick Bullock, I say, flung glances of the bitterest hatred at the little upstart as he rode by with his hand on his side and his hat on one ear, as proud as a lord. Though he was scarcely 11 years of age, Master George wore straps and the most beautiful little boots like a man. He had gilt spurs and a gold-headed whip and a fine pin in his handkerchief, and the neatest little kid gloves which Lamb's Conduit Street could furnish. His mother had given him a couple of neckcloths and carefully hemmed and made some little shirts for him, but when her Eli came to see the widow, they were replaced by much finer linen. He had little jeweled buttons in the lawn shirt fronts. Her humble presents had been put aside. I believe Miss Osborne had given them to the coachman's boy. Amelia tried to think she was pleased at the change. Indeed, she was happy and charmed to see the boy looking so beautiful. She had a little black profile of him done for a shilling, and this was hung up by the side of another portrait over her bed. One day the boy came on his accustomed visit, galloping down the little street at Brompton, and bringing as usual all the inhabitants to the windows to admire his splendor, and with great eagerness and a look of triumph in his face he pulled a case out of his greatcoat. It was a natty white greatcoat with a cape and a velvet collar. Pulled out a red morocco case, which he gave her. "I bought it with my own money, mamma," he said. "I thought you'd like it." Amelia opened the case, and giving a little cry of delighted affection, seized the boy and embraced him 100 times. It was a miniature of himself, very prettily done, though not half handsome enough, we may be sure, the widow thought. His grandfather had wished to have a picture of him by an artist whose works, exhibited in a shop window in Southampton Row, had caught the old gentleman's eye, and George, who had plenty of money, bethought him of asking the painter how much a copy of the little portrait would cost, saying that he would pay for it out of his own money, and that he wanted to give it to his mother. The pleased painter executed it for a small price, and old Osborne himself, when he heard of the incident, growled out his satisfaction, and gave the boy twice as many sovereigns as he had paid for the miniature. But what was the grandfather's pleasure compared to Amelia's ecstasy? That proof of the boy's affection charmed her so that she thought no child in the world was like hers for goodness. For long weeks after, the thought of his love made her happy. She slept better with the picture under her pillow, and how many, many times did she kiss it and weep and pray over it. A small kindness from those she loved made that timid heart grateful. Since her parting with George, she had had no such joy and consolation. At his new home, Master George ruled like a lord. At dinner he invited the ladies to drink wine with the utmost coolness, and took off his champagne in a way which charmed his old grandfather. "Look at him," the old man would say, nudging his neighbour with a delighted purple face. "D'ye ever see such a chap? Lord, Lord, he'll be ordering a dressing-case next, and razors to shave with, I'm blessed if he won't." The antics of the lad did not, however, delight Mr. Osborne's friends so much as they pleased the old gentleman. It gave Mr. Justice Coffin no pleasure to hear Georgie cut into the conversation and spoil his stories. Colonel Fogey was not interested in seeing the little boy half tipsy. Mr. Sergeant Toffy's lady felt no particular gratitude when, with a twist of his elbow, he tilted a glass of port wine over her yellow satin, and laughed at the disaster. Nor was she better pleased, although old Osborne was highly delighted, when Georgie whopped her third boy, a young gentleman a year older than Georgie, and by chance home for the holidays for Dr. Ticklas's at Ealing School, in Russell Square. George's grandfather gave the boy a couple of sovereigns for that feat, and promised to reward him further for every boy above his own size and age whom he whopped in a similar manner. It is difficult to say what the good old man saw in these combats. He had a vague notion that quarreling made boys hardy, and that tyranny was a useful accomplishment for them to learn. English youth have been so educated time out of mind, and we have hundreds of thousands of apologists and admirers of injustice, misery, and brutality as perpetrated amongst children. Flushed with praise and victory over Master Toffee, George wished naturally to pursue his conquests further, and one day as he was strutting about in prodigiously dandified new clothes near St. Pancras, a young baker's boy made sarcastic comments upon his appearance. The youthful patrician pulled off his dandy jacket with great spirit, and giving it in charge to the friend who accompanied him, Master Todd of Great Coram Street, Russell Square, the son of the junior partner of the house of Osborne and Co., George tried to whop the little baker. But the chances of war were unfavorable at this time, and the little baker whopped Georgie, who came home with a rueful black eye, and all his fine shirt frill dabbled with the claret drawn from his own little nose. He told his grandfather that he had been in combat with a giant, and frightened his poor mother at Brompton with long and by no means authentic accounts of the battle. This young Todd of Coram Street, Russell Square, was Master George's great friend and admirer. They both had a taste for painting theatrical characters, for hardbake and raspberry tarts, for sliding and skating in the Regent's Park and the Serpentine when the weather permitted, for going to the play, whither they were often conducted, by Mr. Osborne's orders, by Rowson, Master George's appointed body-servant, with whom they sat in great comfort in the pit. In the company of this gentleman they visited all the principal theatres of the metropolis, knew the names of all the actors from Drury Lane to Sadler's Wells, and performed, indeed, many of the plays to the Todd family and their youthful friends, with West's famous characters on their pasteboard theatre. Rowson, the footman, who was of a generous disposition, would not unfrequently, when in cash, treat his young master to oysters after the play, and to a glass of rum shrub for a nightcap. We may be pretty certain that Mr. Rowson profited in his turn by his young master's liberality and gratitude for the pleasures to which the footman inducted him. A famous tailor from the west end of the town, Mr. Osborne would have none of your City or Holborn bunglers, he said, for the boy, though a city tailor was good enough for him, was summoned to ornament little George's person, and was told to spare no expense in so doing. So Mr. Woolsey, of Conduit Street, gave a loose to his imagination and sent the child home fancy trousers, fancy waistcoats, and fancy jackets enough to furnish a school of little dandies. George had little white waistcoats for evening parties, and little cut velvet waistcoats for dinners, and a dear little darling shawl dressing-gown for all the world like a little man. He dressed for dinner every day, "like a regular West End swell," as his grandfather remarked. One of the domestics was affected to his special service, attended him at his toilette, answered his bell, and brought him his letters, always on a silver tray. Georgie, after breakfast, would sit in the armchair in the dining-room and read the Morning Post, just like a grown-up man. "How he do damn and swear!" the servants would cry, delighted at his precocity. Those who remembered the captain, his father, declared Master George was his pa, every inch of him. He made the house lively by his activity, his imperiousness, his scolding, and his good nature. George's education was confided to a neighbouring scholar and private pedagogue, who prepared young noblemen and gentlemen for the universities, the senate, and the learned professions, whose system did not embrace the degrading corporal severities still practised at the ancient places of education, and in whose family the pupils would find the elegances of refined society and the confidence and affection of a home. It was in this way that the Reverend Lawrence Veal of Hart Street, Bloomsbury, and domestic chaplain to the Earl of Bareacres, strove with Mrs. Veal, his wife, to entice pupils. By thus advertising and pushing sedulously, the domestic chaplain and his lady generally succeeded in having one or two scholars by them, who paid a high figure and were thought to be in uncommonly comfortable quarters. There was a large West Indian, whom nobody came to see, with a mahogany complexion, a woolly head, and an exceedingly dandified appearance. There was another hulking boy of 23, whose education had been neglected, and whom Mr. and Mrs. Veal were to introduce into the polite world. There were 2 sons of Colonel Bangles of the East India Company's service. These 4 sat down to dinner at Mrs. Veal's genteel board when Georgie was introduced to her establishment. Georgie was, like some dozen other pupils, only a day boy. He arrived in the morning under the guardianship of his friend Mr. Rowson, and if it was fine, would ride away in the afternoon on his pony, followed by the groom. The wealth of his grandfather was reported in the school to be prodigious. The Reverend Mr. Veal used to compliment Georgie upon it personally, warning him that he was destined for a high station, that it became him to prepare, by sedulity and docility in youth, for the lofty duties to which he would be called in mature age, that obedience in the child was the best preparation for command in the man, and that he therefore begged George would not bring toffee into the school and ruin the health of the Masters Bangles, who had everything they wanted at the elegant and abundant table of Mrs. Veal. With respect to learning, the curriculum, as Mr. Veal loved to call it, was of prodigious extent, and the young gentlemen in Hart Street might learn a something of every known science. The Reverend Mr. Veal had an orrery, an electrifying machine, a turning lathe, a theatre in the wash-house, a chemical apparatus, and what he called a select library of all the works of the best authors of ancient and modern times and languages. He took the boys to the British Museum, and descanted upon the antiquities and the specimens of natural history there, so that the audience would gather round him as he spoke, and all Bloomsbury highly admired him as a prodigiously well-informed man. And whenever he spoke, which he did almost always, he took care to produce the very finest and longest words of which the vocabulary gave him the use, rightly judging that it was as cheap to employ a handsome, large, and sonorous epithet as to use a little stingy one. Thus he would say to George in school, "I observed on my return home from taking the indulgence of an evening's scientific conversation with my excellent friend Dr. Bulders, a true archaeologian, gentlemen, a true archaeologian, that the windows of your venerated grandfather's almost princely mansion in Russell Square were illuminated as if for the purposes of festivity. Am I right in my conjecture that Mr. Osborne entertained a society of chosen spirits round his sumptuous board last night?" Little Georgie, who had considerable humour, and used to mimic Mr. Veal to his face with great spirit and dexterity, would reply that Mr. Veal was quite correct in his surmise. Then those friends who had the honour of partaking of Mr. Osborne's hospitality, gentlemen, had no reason, I will lay any wager, to complain of their repast. I myself have been more than once so favoured. By the way, Master Osborne, you came a little late this morning, and have been a defaulter in this respect more than once. I myself, I say, gentlemen, humble as I am, have been found not unworthy to share Mr. Osborne's elegant hospitality, and though I have feasted with the great and noble of the world, for I presume that I may call my excellent friend and patron the Right Honourable George, Earl of Berwick, as one of the number, yet I assure you that the board of the British merchant was to the full as richly served, and his reception as gratifying and noble. Mr. Black, sir, we will resume, if you please, that passage of Eutropis which was interrupted by the late arrival of Mr. Osborne. To this great man George's education was for some time entrusted. Amelia was bewildered by his phrases, but thought him a prodigy of learning. That poor widow made friends of Mrs. Veal, for reasons of her own. She liked to be in the house and see Georgie coming to school there. She liked to be asked to Mrs. Veal's conversazione, which took place once a month, as you were informed, on pink cards with AOHNH engraved on them, and where the professor welcomed his pupils and their little friends to weak tea and scientific conversation. Poor little Amelia never missed one of these entertainments, and thought them delicious so long as she might have Georgie sitting by her. And she would walk from Brompton in any weather, and embrace Mrs. Veal with tearful gratitude for the delightful evening she had passed, when, the company having retired, and Georgie gone off with Mr. Rowson, his attendant, poor Mrs. Osborne put on her cloaks and her shawls, preparatory to walking home. As for the learning which Georgie imbibed under this valuable master of 100 sciences, to judge from the weekly reports which the lad took home to his grandfather, his progress was remarkable. The names of a score or more of desirable branches of knowledge were printed in a table, and the pupil's progress in each was marked by the professor. In Greek, Georgie was pronounced Aristos; in Latin, Optimus; in French, Très bien, and so forth, and everybody had prizes for everything at the end of the year. Even Mr. Swartz, the woolly-headed young gentleman, and half-brother to the Honourable Mrs. Mac-Mull, and Mr. Bluck, the neglected young pupil of 3 and 20 from the agricultural district, and that idle young scapegrace of a Master Todd before mentioned, received little 18-penny books with Athene engraved on them, and a pompous Latin inscription from the professor to his young friends. The family of this Master Todd were hangers-on of the house of Osborne. The old gentleman had advanced Todd from being a clerk to be a junior partner in his establishment. Mr. Osborne was the godfather of young Master Todd, who in subsequent life wrote Mr. Osborne Todd on his cards and became a man of decided fashion, while Miss Osborne had accompanied Miss Maria Todd to the font and gave her protégé a prayer book, a collection of tracts, a volume of very low church poetry, or some such memento of her goodness every year. Miss O. drove the Todds out in her carriage now and then. When they were ill, her footman, in large plush smalls and waistcoat, brought jellies and delicacies from Russell Square to Coram Street. Coram Street trembled, and looked up to Russell Square indeed, and Mrs. Todd, who had a pretty hand at cutting out paper trimmings for haunches of mutton, and could make flowers, ducks, etc., out of turnips and carrots in a very creditable manner, would go to the square, as it was called, and assist in the preparations incident to a great dinner, without even so much as thinking of sitting down to the banquet. If any guest failed at the 11th hour, Todd was asked to dine. Mrs. Todd and Maria came across in the evening, slipped in with a muffled knock, and were in the drawing-room by the time Miss Osborne and the ladies under her convoy reached that apartment, and ready to fire off duets and sing until the gentlemen came up. Poor Maria Todd, poor young lady! How she had to work and thrum at these duets and sonatas in the street before they appeared in public in the square. Thus it seemed to be decreed by fate that Georgie was to domineer over everybody with whom he came in contact, and that friends, relatives, and domestics were all to bow the knee before the little fellow. It must be owned that he accommodated himself very willingly to this arrangement. Most people do so. And Georgie liked to play the part of master, and perhaps had a natural aptitude for it. In Russell Square everybody was afraid of Mr. Osborne, and Mr. Osborne was afraid of Georgie. The boy's dashing manners and offhand rattle about books and learning, his likeness to his father, dead unreconciled in Brussels yonder, awed the old gentleman, and gave the young boy the mastery. The old man would start at some hereditary feature or tone unconsciously used by the little lad, and fancy that George's father was again before him. He tried by indulgence to the grandson to make up for harshness to the elder George. People were surprised at his gentleness to the boy. He growled and swore at Miss Osborne as usual, and would smile when Georgie came down late for breakfast. Miss Osborne, Georgie's aunt, was a faded old spinster, broken down by more than 40 years of dullness and coarse usage. It was easy for a lad of spirit to master her, and whenever George wanted anything from her, from the jam-pots in her cupboards to the cracked and dried old colours in her paint-box, the old paint-box which she had had when she was a pupil of Mr. Smee, and was still almost young and blooming, Georgie took possession of the object of his desire, which obtained, he took no further notice of his aunt. For his friends and cronies he had a pompous old schoolmaster who flattered him, and a toady, his senior, whom he could thrash. It was dear Mrs. Todd's delight to leave him with her youngest daughter, Rosa Jemima, a darling child of 8 years old. The little pair looked so well together, she would say, but not to the folks in the square, we may be sure. Who knows what might happen? Don't they make a pretty little couple? The fond mother thought. The broken-spirited old maternal grandfather was likewise subject to the little tyrant. He could not help respecting a lad who had such fine clothes and rode with a groom behind him. Georgie, on his side, was in the constant habit of hearing coarse abuse and vulgar satire levelled at John Sedley by his pitiless old enemy, Mr. Osborne. Osborne used to call the other the old pauper, the old coal man, the old bankrupt, and by many other such names of brutal contumely. How was little George to respect a man so prostrate? A few months after he was with his paternal grandfather, Mrs. Sedley died. There had been little love between her and the child. He did not care to show much grief. He came down to visit his mother in a fine new suit of mourning, and was very angry that he could not go to a play upon which he had set his heart. The illness of that old lady had been the occupation and perhaps the safeguard of Amelia. What do men know about women's martyrdoms? We should go mad had we to endure the 100th part of those daily pains which are meekly borne by many women. Ceaseless slavery meeting with no reward. Constant gentleness and kindness met by cruelty as constant. Love, labor, patience, watchfulness, without even so much as the acknowledgment of a good word. All this, how many of them have to bear in quiet, and appear abroad with cheerful faces, as though they felt nothing? Tender slaves that they are, they must needs be hypocrites and weak. From her chair, Amelia's mother had taken to her bed, which she had never left, and from which Mrs. Osborne herself was never absent, except when she ran to see George. The old lady grudged her even those rare visits. She, who had been a kind, smiling, good-natured mother once, in the days of her prosperity, but whom poverty and infirmities had broken down. Her illness or estrangement did not affect Amelia. They rather enabled her to support the other calamity under which she was suffering, and from the thoughts of which she was kept by the ceaseless calls of the invalid. Amelia bore her harshness quite gently, smoothed the uneasy pillow, was always ready with a soft answer to the watchful, querulous voice, soothed the sufferer with words of hope, such as her pious, simple heart could feel best and utter, and closed the eyes that at once looked so tenderly upon her. Then all her time and tenderness were devoted to the consolation and comfort of the bereaved old father, who was stunned by the blow which had befallen him, and stood utterly alone in the world. His wife, his honor, his fortune, everything he loved best, had fallen away from him. There was only Amelia to stand by and support with her gentle arms the tottering, heartbroken old man. We are not going to write the history. It would be too dreary and stupid. I can see Vanity Fair yawning over it d'avance. One day, as the young gentlemen were assembled in the study at the Reverend Mr. Veal's, and the domestic chaplain to the Right Honourable the Earl of Bareacres was spouting away as usual, a smart carriage drove up to the door, decorated with the statue of Athene, and two gentlemen stepped out. The young masters Bangles rushed to the window with a vague notion that their father might have arrived from Bombay. The great hulking scholar of 23, who was crying secretly over a passage of Eutropius, flattened his neglected nose against the panes and looked at the drag, as the laquais de place sprang from the box and let out the persons in the carriage. "It's a fat one and a thin one," Mr. Blux said, as a thundering knock came to the door. Everybody was interested, from the domestic chaplain himself, who hoped he saw the fathers of some future pupils, down to Master Georgie, glad of any pretext for laying his book down. The boy in the shabby livery, with the faded copper buttons, who always thrust himself into the tight coat to open the door, came into the study and said, "Two gentlemen want to see Master Osborne." The professor had had a trifling altercation in the morning with that young gentleman, owing to a difference about the introduction of crackers in school-time, but his face resumed its habitual expression of bland courtesy as he said, "Master Osborne, I give you full permission to go and see your carriage friends, to whom I beg you to convey the respectful compliments of myself and Mrs. Veal." Georgie went into the reception-room and saw the two strangers, whom he looked at with his head up in his usual haughty manner. One was fat, with mustachios, and the other was lean and long, in a blue frock-coat, with a brown face and a grizzled head. "My God, how like he is!" said the long gentleman with a start. "Can you guess who we are, George?" The boy's face flushed up, as it usually did when he was moved, and his eyes brightened. "I don't know the other," he said, "but I should think you must be Major Dobbin." Indeed, it was our old friend. His voice trembled with pleasure as he greeted the boy, taking both the other's hands in his own, drew the lad to him. "Your mother has talked to you about me, has she?" he said, "That she has," Georgie answered, "hundreds and hundreds of times." End of chapter 56.
All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laurie Campbell, March 4th, 2006. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, Chapter 57. Eothen. It was one of the many causes for personal pride with which old Osborne chose to recreate himself that Sedley, his ancient rival, enemy, and benefactor, was in his last days so utterly defeated and humiliated as to be forced to accept pecuniary obligations at the hands of the man who had most injured and insulted him. The successful man of the world cursed the old pauper, and relieved him from time to time. As he furnished George with money for his mother, he gave the boy to understand by hints, delivered in his brutal, coarse way, that George's maternal grandfather was but a wretched old bankrupt and dependent, and that John Sedley might thank the man to whom he already owed ever so much money for the aid with which his generosity now chose to administer. George carried the plies to his mother and the shattered old widower, whom it was now the main business of her life to tend and comfort. The little fellow patronized the feeble and disappointed old man. It may have shown want of proper pride in Amelia that she chose to accept these money benefits at the hands of her father's enemy, but proper pride and this poor lady had never had much acquaintance together. A disposition naturally simple and demanding protection, a long course of poverty and humility, of daily privations and hard words, of kind offices and no returns, had been her lot ever since womanhood almost, or since her luckless marriage with George Osborne. You who see your betters bearing up under this shame every day, meekly suffering under the slights of fortune, gentle and unpitied, poor, and rather despised for their poverty, do you ever step down from your prosperity and wash the feet of those poor wearied beggars? The very thought of them is odious and low. There must be classes, there must be rich and poor, Dives says, smacking his claret. It is well if he ever sends the broken meat out to Lazarus sitting under the window. Very true, but think how mysterious and often unaccountable it is, that lottery of life which gives to this man the purple and fine linen, and sends to the other rags for garments and dogs for comforters. So I must own that, without much repining, on the contrary with something akin to gratitude, Amelia took the crumbs that her father-in-law let drop now and then, and with them fed her own parent. Directly she understood it to be her duty. It was this young woman's nature. Lady, she is but 30 still, and we choose to call her a young woman, even at that age. It was, I say, her nature to sacrifice herself, and to fling all that she had at the feet of the beloved object. During what long thankless nights had she worked out her fingers for little Georgie whilst at home with her? What buffets, scorns, privations, poverties had she endured for her father and mother? And in the midst of all these solitary resignations and unseen sacrifices, she did not respect herself any more than the world respected her, but I believe thought in her heart that she was a poor-spirited, despicable little creature, whose luck in life was only too good for her merits. Oh, you poor women! Oh, you poor secret martyrs and victims, whose life is a torture, who are stretched on racks in your bedrooms, and who lay your heads down on the block daily at the drawing-room table. Every man who watches your pains, or peers into those dark places where the torture is administered to you, must pity you, and thank God he has a beard. I recollect seeing, years ago, at the prisons 4 idiots and madmen at Bicêtre, near Paris, a poor wretch bent down under the bondage of his imprisonment and his personal infirmity, to whom one of our party gave a halfpenny worth of snuff in a cornet or screw of paper. The kindness was too much for the poor epileptic creature. He cried in an anguish of delight and gratitude. If anybody gave you and me 1,000 a year, or saved our lives, we could not be so affected. And so, if you properly tyrannize over a woman, you will find a ha'porth of kindness upon her, and bring tears into her eyes, as though you were an angel benefiting her. Some such boons as these were the best which fortune allotted to poor little Amelia. Her life, begun not unprosperously, had come down to this, to a mean prison and long ignoble bondage. Little George visited her captivity sometimes, and consoled it with feeble gleams of encouragement. Russell Square was the boundary of her prison. She might walk thither occasionally, but was always back to sleep in her cell at night, to perform cheerless duties, to watch by thankless sick-beds, to suffer the harassment and tyranny of querulous, disappointed old age. How many thousands of people are there, women for the most part, who are doomed to endure this long slavery, who are hospital nurses without wages, sisters of charity, if you like, without the romance and the sentiment of sacrifice, who strive, fast, watch, and suffer unpitied, and fade away ignobly and unknown. The hidden and awful wisdom which apportions the destinies of mankind is pleased so to humiliate and cast down the tender, good, and wise, and to set up the selfish, the foolish, or the wicked. Oh, be humble, my brother, in your prosperity. Be gentle with those who are less lucky, if not more deserving. Think what right have you to be scornful, whose virtue is a deficiency of temptation, whose success may be a chance, whose rank may be an ancestor's accident, whose prosperity is very likely a satire. They buried Amelia's mother in the churchyard at Brompton, upon just such a rainy, dark day as Amelia recollected when first she had been there to marry George. Her little boy sat by her side in pompous new sables. She remembered the old pew-woman and clerk. Her thoughts were away in other times as the parson read. But that she held George's hand in her own, perhaps she would have liked to change places with. Then, as usual, she felt alarmed at her selfish thoughts and prayed inwardly to be strengthened to do her duty. So she determined with all her might and strength to try and make her old father happy. She slaved, toiled, patched and mended, sang and played backgammon, read out the newspaper, cooked dishes for old Seedley, walked him out sedulously into Kensington Gardens or the Brompton Lanes, listened to his stories with untiring smiles and affectionate hypocrisy, or sat musing by his side and communing with her own thoughts and reminiscences, as the old man, feeble and querulous, sunned himself on the garden benches and prattled about his wrongs or his sorrows. What sad, unsatisfactory thoughts those of the widow were. The children running up and down the slopes and broad paths in the gardens reminded her of George, who was taken from her. The first George was taken from her. Her selfish, guilty love in both instances had been rebuked and bitterly chastised. She strove to think it was right that she should be so punished. She was such a miserable, wicked sinner. She was quite alone in the world. I know that the account of this kind of solitary imprisonment is insufferably tedious, unless there is some cheerful or humorous incident to enliven it. A tender gaoler, for instance, or a waggish commandant of the fortress, or a mouse to come out and play about Latude's beard and whiskers, or a subterranean passage under the castle, dug by Trenck with his nails and a toothpick. The historian has no such enlivening incident to relate in the narrative of Amelia's captivity. Fancy her, if you please, during this period, very sad, but always ready to smile when spoken to, in a very mean, poor, not to say vulgar position of life, singing songs, making puddings, playing cards, mending stockings, for her old father's benefit. So never mind whether she be a heroine or no, or you and I, however old, scolding and bankrupt, may we have in our last days a kind, soft shoulder on which to lean, and a gentle hand to soothe our gouty old pillows. Old Sedley grew very fond of his daughter after his wife's death, and Amelia had her consolation in doing her duty by the old man. But we are not going to leave these two people long in such a low and ungenteel station of life. Better days, as far as worldly prosperity went, were in store for both. Perhaps the ingenious reader has guessed who was the stout gentleman who called upon Georgie at his school in company with our old friend Major Dobbin. It was another old acquaintance returned to England, and at a time when his presence was likely to be of great comfort to his relatives there. Major Dobbin, having easily succeeded in getting leave from his good-natured commandant to proceed to Madras, and thence probably to Europe on urgent private affairs, never ceased travelling night and day until he reached his journey's end, and had directed his march with such clarity that he arrived in Madras in a high fever. His servants who accompanied him brought him to the house of the friend with whom he had resolved to stay until his departure for Europe in a state of delirium, and it was thought for many, many days that he would never travel further than the burying ground of the church of St. George's, where the troops should fire a salvo over his grave, and where many a gallant officer lies, far away from his home. Here, as the poor fellow lay tossing in his fever, the people who watched him might have heard him raving about Amelia. The idea that he should never see her again depressed him in his lucid hours. He thought his last day was come, and he made solemn preparations for departure, setting his affairs in this world in order, and leaving the little property of which he was possessed to those whom he most desired to benefit. The friend in whose house he was located witnessed his testament. He desired to be buried with a little brown hair chain which he wore round his neck, and which, if the truth must be known, he had got from Amelia's maid at Brussels, when the young widow's hair was cut off during the fever which prostrated her after the death of George Osborne on the plateau at Mount St. John. He recovered, rallied, relapsed again, having undergone such a process of bloodletting and calomel as showed the strength of his original constitution. He was almost a skeleton when they put him on board the Ramchunder East Indiaman, Captain Bragg from Calcutta touching at Madras, and so weak and prostrate that his friends, who attended him through his illness, prophesied that the honest major would never survive the voyage, and that he would pass some morning, shrouded in flag and hammock, over the ship's side, and carrying down to the sea with him the relic that he wore at his heart. But whether it was the sea air or the hope which sprung up in him afresh, from the day that the ship spread her canvas and stood out of the roads towards home, our friend began to amend, and he was quite well, though as gaunt as a greyhound, before they reached the Cape. "Kirk will be disappointed of his majority this time," he said with a smile. "He will expect to find himself gazetted by the time the regiment reaches home." For it must be premised that while the major was lying ill at Madras, having made such prodigious haste to go thither, the gallant Ninth, which had passed many years abroad, which after its return from the West Indies had been balked of its stay at home by the Waterloo campaign, and had been ordered from Flanders to India, had received orders home, and the major might have accompanied his comrades had he chosen to wait for their arrival at Madras. Perhaps he was not inclined to put himself in his exhausted state again under the guardianship of Glorvina. "I think Miss O'Dowd would have done for me," he said laughingly to a fellow passenger. "If we had had her on board, and when she had sunk me, she would have fallen upon you, depend upon it, and carried you in as a prize to Southampton, Joss, my boy." For indeed it was no other than our stout friend who was also a passenger on board the Ramchunder. He had passed 10 years in Bengal, constant dinners, tiffins, pale ale and claret, the prodigious labour of cutchery, and the refreshment of a brandy pawnee, which he was forced to take there, had the effect upon Waterloo Seedley. A voyage to Europe was pronounced necessary for him, and having served his full time in India, and had fine appointments which had enabled him to lay by a considerable sum of money, he was free to come home and stay with a good pension, or to return and resume that rank in the service to which his seniority and his vast talents entitled him. He was rather thinner than when we last saw him, but had gained in majesty and solemnity of demeanour. He had resumed the mustachios to which his services at Waterloo entitled him, and swaggered about on deck in a magnificent velvet cap with a gold band and a profuse ornamentation of pins and jewellery about his person. He took breakfast in his cabin and dressed as solemnly to appear on the quarter-deck as if he was going to turn out for Bond Street or the course at Calcutta. He brought a native servant with him, who was his valet and pipe-bearer, and who wore the Seedley crest in silver on his turban. That oriental menial had a wretched life under the tyranny of Joss Seedley. Joss was as vain of his person as a woman, and took as long a time at his toilette as any fading beauty. The youngsters among the passengers, young chaffers of the 150th, and poor little Ricketts coming home after his third fever, used to draw out Seedley at the cuddy table and make him tell prodigious stories about himself and his exploits against tigers and Napoleon. He was great when he visited the Emperor's tomb at Longwood, when to these gentlemen and the young officers of the ship, Major Dobbin not being by, he described the whole battle of Waterloo, and all but announced that Napoleon never would have gone to St. Helena at all but for him, Joss Seedley. After leaving St. Helena, he became very generous, disposing of a great quantity of ship's stores, claret, preserved meats, and great casks packed with soda water, brought out for his private delectation. There were no ladies on board, and Major gave the passive precedence to the civilian, so that he was the first dignitary at the table, and treated by Captain Bragg and the officers of the Ramchunder with the respect with which his rank warranted. He disappeared rather in a panic during a 2 days' gale, in which he had the portals of his cabin battened down, and remained in his cot, reading the Washerwoman of Finchley Common, left on board the Ramchunder by the Right Honourable the Lady Emily Hornblower, wife of the Reverend Silas Hornblower, when on their passage out to the Cape, where the reverend gentleman was a missionary. But for common reading he had brought a stock of novels and plays, which he lent to the rest of the ship, and rendered himself agreeable to all by his kindness and condescension. Many and many a night, as the ship was cutting through the roaring dark sea, the moon and stars shining overhead, and the bells singing out the watch, Mr. Seedley and the Major would sit on the quarter-deck of the vessel, talking about home, as the Major smoked his cheroot, and the civilian puffed at the hookah which his servant prepared for him. In these conversations it was wonderful with what perseverance and ingenuity Major Dobbin would manage to bring the talk round to the subject of Amelia and her little boy. Jos, a little testy about his father's misfortunes and unceremonious applications to him, was soothed down by the Major, who pointed out that the elder's ill fortunes and old age. He would not perhaps like to live with the old couple, whose ways and hours might not agree with those of a younger man, accustomed to different society. Jos bowed at this compliment. But the Major pointed out how advantageous it would be for Jos Seedley to have a house of his own in London, and not a mere bachelor's establishment as before. How his sister Amelia would be the very person to preside over it, how elegant, how gentle she was, and of what refined good manners. He recounted stories of the success with which Mrs. George Osborne had had in former days at Brussels, and in London, where she was much admired by people of very great fashion, and he then hinted how becoming it would be for Jos to send Georgie to a good school and make a man of him, for his mother and her parents would be sure to spoil him. In a word, the artful Major made the civilian promise to take charge of Amelia and her unprotected child. He did not know as yet what events had happened in the little Sedley family, and how death had removed the mother, and riches had carried off George from Amelia. But the fact is that every day and always this love-smitten and middle-aged gentleman was thinking about Mrs. Osborne, and his whole heart was bent upon doing her good. He coaxed, wheedled, cajoled, and complimented Jos Sedley with a perseverance and cordiality of which he was not aware himself, very likely. But some men who have unmarried sisters, or daughters even, may remember how uncommonly agreeable gentlemen are to the male relations when they are courting the females, and perhaps this rogue of a Dobbin was under a similar hypocrisy. The truth is, when Major Dobbin came on board the Ramchunder, very sick, and for the 3 days she lay in the Madras roads, he did not begin to rally, nor did even the appearance and recognition of his old acquaintance, Mr. Sedley, on board much cheer him, until after a conversation which they had one day, as the Major was laid languidly on the deck. He said then he thought he was doomed. He had left a little something to his godson in his will, and he trusted Mrs. Osborne would remember him kindly and be happy in the marriage she was about to make. "Married? Not the least," Jos answered. He had heard from her. She made no mention of the marriage, and by the way, it was curious, she wrote to say that Major Dobbin was going to be married, and hoped that he would be happy. What were the dates of Sedley's letters from Europe? The civilian fetched them. They were 2 months later than the Major's, and the ship's surgeon congratulated himself upon the treatment adopted by him towards his new patient, who had been consigned to shipboard by the Madras practitioner with very small hopes indeed. For from that day, the very day that he changed the draft, Major Dobbin began to mend. And thus it was that deserving officer, Captain Kirk, was disappointed of his majority. After they passed St. Helena, Major Dobbin's gaiety and strength was such as to astonish all his fellow passengers. He larked with the midshipmen, played single stick with the mates, ran up the shrouds like a boy, sang a comic song one night to the amusement of the whole party assembled over their grog after supper, and rendered himself so gay, lively, and amiable that even Captain Bragg, who thought there was nothing in his passenger, and considered he was a poor-spirited feller at first, was constrained to own that Major was a reserved but well-informed and meritorious officer. "He ain't got D'Stangy manners, damme," Bragg observed to his first mate. "He wouldn't do a government house, Roper, where his lordship and Lady William were as kind to me, and shook hands with me before the whole company, and asking me at dinner to take beer with him before the Commander-in-Chief himself. He ain't got manners, but there's something about him." And thus Captain Bragg showed that he possessed discrimination as a man, as well as ability as a commander. But a calm taking place when the Ramchunder was within 10 days' sail of England, Dobbin became so impatient and ill-humoured as to surprise those comrades whom had before admired his vivacity and good temper. He did not recover until the breeze sprang up again, and was in a highly excited state when the pilot came on board. Good God, how his heart beat as the 2 friendly spires of Southampton came in sight. End of chapter 57. Vox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laurie Campbell, March 4th, 2006. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray. Chapter 58. Our Friend the Major. Our Major had rendered himself so popular on board the Ramchunder that when he and Mr. Sedley descended into the welcome shore-boat which was to take them from the ship, the whole crew, men and officers, the great Captain Bragg himself leading off, gave 3 cheers for Major Dobbin, who blushed very much and ducked his head in token of thanks. Joss, who very likely thought these cheers were for himself, took off his gold-laced cap and waved it majestically to his friends, and they were pulled to shore and landed with great dignity at the pier, where they proceeded to the Royal George Hotel. Although the sight of that magnificent round of beef and the silver tankard suggestive of real British home-brewed ale and porter, which perennially greet the eyes of the traveller returning from foreign parts, who enters the coffee-room of the George, are so invigorating and delightful that a man entering such a comfortable, snug, homely English inn might well like to stop some days there. Yet Dobbin began to talk about a post-chaise instantly, and was no sooner at Southampton than he wished to be on the road to London. Joss, however, would not hear of moving that evening. Why was he to pass a night in a post-chaise instead of a great, large, undulating, downy feather-bed, which was there ready to replace the horrid little narrow crib in which the portly Bengal gentleman had been confined during the voyage? He could not think of moving till his baggage was cleared, or of travelling until he could do so with his chillum. So the Major was forced to wait over that night, and dispatched a letter to his family announcing his arrival, entreating from Joss a promise to write to his own friends. Joss promised, but didn't keep his promise. The captain, the surgeon, and 1 or 2 passengers came and dined with our 2 gentlemen at the inn, Joss exerting himself in a sumptuous way in ordering the dinner and promising to go to town the next day with the Major. The landlord said it did his eyes good to see Mr. Sedley take off his first pint of porter. If I had time and dared to enter into digressions, I would write a chapter about that first pint of porter drunk upon English ground. Ah, how good it is! It is worth while to leave home for a year just to enjoy that one draught. Major Dobbin made his appearance the next morning, very neatly shaved and dressed, according to his wont. Indeed, it was so early in the morning that nobody was up in the house except that wonderful Boots of an inn, who never seems to want sleep. And the Major could hear the snores of the various inmates of the house roaring through the corridors as he creaked about in those dim passages. Then the sleepless Boots went shirking round from door to door, gathering up at each the Bluchers, Wellingtons, Oxonians, which stood outside. Then Joss's native servant arose and began to get ready his master's ponderous dressing-up apparatus and prepare his hookah. Then the maidservants got up, and meeting the dark man in the passages, shrieked and mistook him for the devil. He and Dobbin stumbled over their pails in the passages as they were scouring the decks of the Royal George. When the first unshorn waiter appeared and unbarred barred the doors of the inn, the Major thought that the time for a departure was arrived, and ordered a post-chaise to be fetched instantly that they might set off. He then directed his steps to Mr. Sidley's room, and opened the curtains of the great large family bed wherein Mr. Joss was snoring. "Come up, Sedley," the Major said. "It's time to be off. The chaise will be here at the door in half an hour." Joss growled from under the counterpane to know what time it was, but when he at last extorted from the blushing Major, who never told fibs, however they might be to his advantage, what was the real hour of the morning, he broke out into a volley of bad language, which we will not repeat here, but by which he gave Dobbin to understand that he would jeopardy his soul if he got up that moment, that the Major might go and be hanged, that he would not travel with Dobbin, and that it was a most unkind and ungentlemanlike to disturb a man out of his sleep in that way, on which the discomforted Major was obliged to retreat, leaving Joss to resume his interrupted slumbers. The chaise came up presently, and the Major would wait no longer. If he had been an English nobleman travelling on a pleasure tour, or a newspaper courier bearing dispatches, government messages are generally carried much more quietly, he could not have travelled more quickly. The postboys wondered at the fees he flung amongst them. How happy and green the country looked as the chaise whirled rapidly from milestone to milestone, through neat country towns where landlords came out to welcome him with smiles and bows, by pretty roadside inns where the signs hung on the elms, and horses and waggoners were drinking under the checkered shadows of the trees, by old halls and parks, rustic hamlets clustered round ancient grey churches, and through the charming, friendly English landscape. Is there any in the world like it? To a traveller returning home it looks so kind. It seems to shake hands with you as you pass through it. Well, Major Dobbin passed through all this from Southampton to London without noting much beyond the milestones along the road. You see, he was so eager to see his parents at Camberwell. He grudged the time lost between Piccadilly and his old haunt at the Slaughters, where he drove faithfully. Long years had passed since he saw it last, since he and George, as young men, had enjoyed many a feast and held many a revel there. He had now passed into the stage of old fellowhood. His hair was grizzled, and many a passion and feeling of his youth had grown grey in the interval. There, however, stood the old waiter at the door in the same greasy black suit, with the same double chin and flaccid face, with the same huge bunch of seals at his fob, rattling his money in his pockets as before, and receiving the Major as if he had gone away only a week ago. "Put the Major's things in 23, that's his room," John said, exhibiting not the least surprise. "Roast fowl for your dinner, I suppose? You ain't got married? They said you was married. The Scotch surgeon of yours was here." "No, it was Captain Humbley of the 33rd as was quartered with the in Ingy." "Like any warm water? What did you come in a shay for? Ain't the coach good enough?" And with this the faithful waiter, who knew and remembered every officer who used the house, and with whom 10 years were but as yesterday, led the way up to Dobbin's old room, where stood the green moreen bed, the shabby carpet, a thought more dingy, and all the old black furniture covered with faded chintz, just as the Major recollected them in his youth. He remembered George pacing up and down the room, and biting his nails, and swearing that the governor must come round, and that if he didn't care a straw, on the day before he was married. He could fancy him walking in, banging the door of Dobbin's room, and his own hard by. "You ain't got young," John said, calmly surveying his friend of former days. Dobbin laughed. 10 years and a fever don't make a man young, John," he said. "It is you that are always young." "No, you are always old." "What became of Captain Osborne's widow?" John said. "Fine young fellow that. Lord, how he used to spend his money. He never came back after that day he was marched from here. He owes me £3 at this minute. Look here, I have it in my book. April 10th, 1815, Captain Osborne, £3. I wonder whether his father would pay me." And so saying, John of the Slaughters pulled out the very morocco pocket-book in which he had noted his loan to the captain, upon a greasy, faded page still extant, with other scrawled memoranda regarding the bygone frequenters of the house. Having inducted his customer into the room, John retired with perfect calmness, and Major Dobbin, not without a blush and a grin, at his own absurdity, chose out of his kit the very smartest and most becoming civil costume he possessed, and laughed at his own tanned face and grey hair as he surveyed them in the dreary little toilet glass on the dressing-table. "I'm glad old John didn't forget me," he thought. "She'll know me too, I hope." And he sallied out of the inn, bending his steps once more in the direction of Brompton. Every minute incident of his last meeting with Amelia was present to the constant man's mind as he walked towards her house. The arch and the Achilles statue were up since he had last been in Piccadilly. 100 changes had occurred which his eye and mind vaguely noted. He began to tremble as he walked up the lane from Brompton, that well-remembered lane leading to the street where she lived. Was she going to be married or not? If he were to meet her with a little boy, good God, what should he do? He saw a woman coming to him with a child of 5 years old. Was that she? He began to shake at the mere possibility. When he came up to the row of houses at last where she lived, and to the gate, he caught hold of it and paused. He might have heard the thumping of his own heart. "May God Almighty bless her, whatever has happened," he thought to himself. "Psh! She may be gone from here," he said, and went in through the gate. The window of the parlour which she used to occupy was open, and there were no inmates in the room. The Major thought he recognized the piano, though, with the picture over it, as it used to be in former days, and his perturbations were renewed. Mr. Clapp's brass plate was still on the door, at the knocker of which Dobbin performed a summons. A buxom-looking lass of 16, with bright eyes and purple cheeks, came to answer the knock, and looked hard at the Major as he leant back against the little porch. He was as pale as a ghost, and could hardly falter out the words, "Does Mrs. Osborne live here?" She looked him hard in the face for a moment, and then, turning white too, said, "Lord bless me, it's Major Dobbin." She held out both her hands, shaking. "Don't you remember me?" she said. "I used to call you Major Sugarplums." On which, and I believe it was for the first time that he ever so conducted himself in his life, the Major took the girl in his arms and kissed her. She began to laugh and cry hysterically, and calling out "Ma! Pa!" with all her voice, brought up those worthy people, who had already been surveying the Major from the casement of the ornamental kitchen, and were astonished to find their daughter in the little passage in the embrace of a great tall man in a blue frock-coat and white duck trousers. "I'm an old friend," he said, not without blushing, though. "Don't you remember me, Mrs. Clapp, and those good cakes you used to make for tea? Don't you recollect me, Clapp? I'm George's godfather, and just come back from India." A great shaking of hands ensued. Mrs. Clapp was greatly affected and delighted. She called upon heaven to interpose a vast many times in that passage. The landlord and the landlady of the house led the worthy Major into the Sedleys' room, whereof he remembered every single article of furniture, from the old brass-ornamented piano, once a natty little instrument, Stothard maker, to the screens and the alabaster miniature tombstone, in the midst of which ticked Mr. Sedley's gold watch. And there, as he sat down in the lodger's vacant armchair, the father, the mother, and the daughter, with 1,000 ejaculatory breaks in the narrative, informed Major Dobbin of what we know already, but of particulars in Amelia's history of which he was not aware, namely Mrs. Sedley's death, of George's reconcilement with his grandfather Osborne, of the way in which the widow took on at leaving him, and of other particulars of her life. Twice or thrice he was going to ask about the marriage question, but his heart failed him. He did not care to lay it bare to these people. Finally he was informed that Mrs. O. was gone to walk with her pa in Kensington Gardens, whither she always went with the old gentleman, who was very weak and peevish now, and led her a sad life, though she behaved to him like an angel, to be sure. Of a fine afternoon, after dinner. "I'm very much pressed for time," the Major said, "and have business tonight of importance. I should like to see Mrs. Osborne, though. Suppose Miss Polly would come with me and show me the way." Miss Polly was charmed and astonished at this proposal. She knew the way. She would show Major Dobbin. She had often been with Mr. Sedley when Mrs. O. was gone Russell Square way, and knew the bench where he liked to sit. She bounced away to her apartment, and appeared presently in her best bonnet and her mamma's yellow shawl and large pebble brooch. of which she assumed the loan in order to make herself a worthy companion for the Major. That officer then, in his blue frock coat and buckskin gloves, gave the young lady his arm, and they walked away very gaily. He was glad to have a friend at hand for the scene which he dreaded somehow. He asked 1,000 more questions from his companion about Amelia. His kind heart grieved to think that she should have had to part with her son. How did she bear it? Did she see him often? Was Mr. Sedley pretty comfortable now, in a worldly point of view? Polly answered all these questions of Major Sugarplums to the very best of her power. And in the midst of their walk, an incident occurred which, though very simple in its nature, was productive of the greatest delight to Major Dobbin. A pale young man with feeble whiskers and a stiff white neckcloth came walking down the lane, on sandwich, having a lady, that is, on each arm. One was tall and commanding, middle-aged female, with features and a complexion similar to those of the clergyman of the Church of England by whose sides she marched, and the other a stunted little woman with a dark face, ornamented by a fine new bonnet and white ribbons, and in a smart pelisse, with a rich gold watch in the midst of her person. The gentleman, pinioned as he was by these two ladies, carried further a parasol, a shawl, and basket, so that his arms were entirely engaged, and of course he was unable to touch his hat, in acknowledgment of the curtsy with which Miss Mary Clapp greeted him. He merely bowed his head in reply to her salutation, which the two ladies returned with a patronizing air, and at the same time looking severely at the individual in the blue coat and bamboo cane who accompanied Miss Polly. "Who's that?" asked the Major, amused by the group, and after he had made way for the three of them to pass up the lane. Mary looked at him rather roguishly. "That is our curate, the Reverend Mr. Binney," a twitch from Major Dobbin, "and his sister, Miss B. Lord bless us, how she did use to worrit us at Sunday school. And the other lady, the little one with the cast in her eye and the handsome watch, is Mrs. Binney. Miss Grits that was. Her pa was a grocer, and kept the little original gold teapot in Kensington Gravel Pits. They were married last month, and are just come back from Margate. She's £5,000 to her fortune, but her and Miss B, who made the match, have quarrelled already." If the Major had twitched before, he started now, and slapped the bamboo on the ground with an emphasis which made Miss Clapp cry, "Law!" and laugh too. He stood for a moment silent, with open mouth, looking at the retreating young couple, while Miss Mary told their history. But he did not hear beyond the announcement of the reverend gentleman's marriage. His head was swimming with felicity. After this rencontre, he began to walk double-quick towards the place of his destination, and yet they were too soon, for he was in a great tremor at the idea of meeting, for which he had been longing any time these last 10 years. Through the Brompton lanes, and entering at the little old portal in Kensington Garden Wall. "There they are," said Miss Polly, and she felt him again start back on her arm. She was a confidante at once of the whole business. She knew the story as well as if she'd read it in one of her favourite novels, Fatherless Fanny, or The Scottish Chiefs. "Suppose you were to run on and tell her," the Major said. Polly ran forward, her yellow shawl streaming in the breeze. Old Sedley was seated on a bench, his handkerchief placed over his knees, prattling away, according to his wont, with some old story about old times to which Amelia had listened and awarded a patient smile many a time before. She could of late think of her own affairs, and smile or make other remarks of recognition of her father's stories, scarcely hearing a word of the old man's tales. As Mary came bouncing along, and as Amelia caught sight of her, she started up from her bench. Her first thought was that something had happened to Georgie, but the sight of the messenger's eager and happy face dissipated that fear in the timorous mother's breast. "News! News!" cried the emissary of Major Dobbin. "He's come! He's come!" "Who is come?" said Amy, still thinking of her son. "Look there!" answered Mrs. Clapp, turning round and pointing, in which direction Amelia, looking, saw Dobbin's lean figure and long shadow stalking across the grass. Amelia started in her turn, blushed up, and of course began to cry. At all this simple little creature's fêtes, the grand O were accustomed to play. He looked at her, oh how fondly, as she came running towards him, her hands before her, ready to give them to him. She wasn't changed. She was a little pale, a little stouter in figure. Her eyes were the same, the kind, trustful eyes. There were scarce 3 lines of silver in her soft brown hair. She gave him both her hands as she looked up flushing and smiling through her tears into this honest, homely face. He took the 2 little hands between his 2 and held them there. He was speechless for a moment. Why did he not take her in his arms and swear that he would never leave her? She must have yielded. She could not but have obeyed him. I've another arrival to announce," he said after a pause. "Mrs. Dobbin?" Amelia said, making a movement back. Why didn't he speak? "No," he said, letting her hands go. "Who has told you those lies? I mean your brother Joss came in the same ship with me, and has come home to make you all happy." "Papa, papa!" Emily cried out. "Here are news. My brother is in England. He has come to take care of you. Here is Major Dobbin." Mr. Sedley started up, shaking a great deal, and gathering up his thoughts. Then he stepped forward and made an old-fashioned bow to the Major, whom he called Mr. Dobbin, and hoped his worthy father, Sir William, was quite well. He proposed to call upon Sir William, who had done him the honour of a visit a short time ago. Sir William had not called upon the old gentleman for 8 years. It was that visit he was thinking of returning. "He's very much shaken," Emmy whispered, as Dobbin went up and cordially shook hands with the old man. Although he had had such particular business in London that evening, the Major consented to forego it upon Mr. Sedley's invitation to him to come home and partake of tea. Amelia put her arm under that of her young friend with the yellow shawl and headed the party on their return home, so that Mr. Sedley fell to Dobbin's share. The old man walked very slowly, and told a number of ancient histories about himself and his poor Bessie, his former prosperity and his bankruptcy. His thoughts, as is usual with failing old men, were quite in former times. The present, with the exception of the one catastrophe which he felt, he knew little about. The Major was glad to let him talk on. His eyes were fixed upon the figure in front of him, the dear little figure always present to his imagination and in his prayers, and visiting his dreams, wakeful or slumbering. Amelia was very happy, smiling and active all that evening, performing her duties as hostess of the little entertainment with the utmost grace and propriety, as Dobbin thought. His eyes followed her about as they sat in the twilight. How many a time had he longed for that moment, and thought of her far away, under hot winds and in weary marches, gentle and happy, kindly ministering to the wants of old age, and decorating poverty with sweet submission, as he saw her now. I do not say that his taste was the highest, or that it is the duty of great intellects to be content with a bread-and-butter paradise, such as sufficed our simple old friend. But his desires were of this sort, whether for good or bad. And, with Amelia to help him, he was ready to drink as many cups of tea as Dr. Johnson. Amelia, seeing this propensity, laughingly encouraged it, and looked exceedingly roguish as she administered to him cup after cup. It is true she did not know that the Major had had no dinner, and that the cloth was laid for him at the Slaughters', and a plate laid thereon to mark that the table was retained, in the very box in which the Major and George had sat many a time carousing, when she was a child, just come home from Miss Pinkerton's school. The first thing that Mrs. Osborne showed the Major was Georgie's miniature, for which she ran upstairs on her arrival at home. It was not half handsome enough, of course, for the boy, but wasn't it noble of him to think of bringing it to his mother? Whilst her papa was awake, she did not talk much about Georgie. To hear about Mr. Osborne and Russell Square was not agreeable to the old man, who very likely was unconscious that he had been living for some months past mainly on the bounty of his richer rival, and lost his temper if allusion were made to the other. Dobbin told him all, and a little more perhaps than all, that had happened on board the Ramchunder, and exaggerated Joss's benevolent dispositions towards his father, and resolution to make him comfortable in his old days. The truth is that during the voyage the Major had impressed this duty most strongly upon his fellow passenger, and extorted promises from him that he would take charge of his sister and her child. He soothed Joss's irritation with regard to the bills which the old gentleman had drawn upon him, gave a laughing account of his own sufferings on the same score, and of the famous consignment of wine which the old man had favoured him, and brought Mr. Joss, who was by no means an ill-natured person when well pleased and moderately flattered, to a very good state of feeling regarding his relations in Europe. At his accustomed hour Mr. Sedley began to doze in his chair, and then it was Amelia's opportunity to commence her conversation, which she did with great eagerness. It related exclusively to Georgie. She did not talk at all about her own sufferings at breaking from him, for indeed this worthy woman, though she was half killed by the separation from the child, yet thought it was very wicked in her to repine at losing him. But everything concerning him, his virtues, his talents, and prospects, she poured out. She described his angelic beauty, narrated 100 instances of his generosity and greatness of mind while living with her, how a royal duchess had stopped and admired him in Kensington Gardens, how splendidly he was cared for now, and how he had a groom and a pony, what quickness and cleverness he had, and what a prodigiously well-read and delightful person the Reverend Lawrence Veal was, George's master. "He knows everything," Amelia said. "He has the most delightful parties. You, who are so learned yourself, and have read so much, and are so clever and accomplished, don't shake your head and say no. He always used to say you were. You will be charmed with Mr. Veal's parties, the last Tuesday every month. He says there's no place in the bar or the senate that Georgie may not aspire to. Look here," and she went to the piano drawer and drew out a theme of Georgie's composition. "This great effort of genius, which is still in the possession of George's mother, is as follows. On selfishness. Of all the vices which degrade the human character, selfishness is the most odious and contemptible. An undue love of self leads to the most monstrous crimes, and occasions the greatest misfortunes, both in states and families. As a selfish man will impoverish his family and often bring them to ruin, so a selfish king brings ruin on his people and often plunges them into war. Example, the selfishness of Achilles, as remarked by the poet Homer, occasioned 1,000 woes to the Greek. Muri Achaeos algae ethike. Homer. The selfishness of the late Napoleon Bonaparte occasioned innumerable wars in Europe, and caused him to perish himself in a miserable island, that of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean. We see by these examples that we are not to consult our own interest and ambition, but we are to consider the interests of others as well as our own. George S. Osborne, Athena House, 24th April, 1827. "Think of him writing such a hand and quoting Greek, too, at his age," the delighted mother said. "Oh, William," she added, holding out her hand to the Major, "what a treasure heaven has given me in that boy! He is the comfort of my life, and he is the image of him that is gone." Ought I to be angry with her for being faithful to him, William thought. Ought I to be jealous of my friend in the grave, or hurt that such a heart as Amelia's can love only once and forever? Oh, George, George, how little you knew the prize you had, though! This sentiment passed rapidly through William's mind as he was holding Amelia's hand, whilst the handkerchief was veiling her eyes. "Dear friend," she said, pressing the hand which held hers, "how good, how kind you've always been to me. See, Papa is stirring. You will go and see Georgie tomorrow, won't you?" "Not tomorrow," said poor old Dobbin. "I have business." He did not like to own that he had not as yet been to his parents and his dear sister Anne, a remissness for which I am sure every well-regulated person will blame the Major. Presently he took his leave, leaving his address behind him for Joss, against the latter's arrival. And so the first day was over, and he had seen her. When he got back to the Slaughters, the roast fowl was of course cold, in which condition he ate it for supper. And knowing what early hours his family kept, and that it would be needless to disturb their slumbers at so late an hour, it is on record that Major Dobbin treated himself to half price at the Haymarket Theatre that evening, where let us hope he enjoyed himself. End of chapter 58. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Laurie Campbell, March 5th, 2006, Halifax, Nova Scotia. Vanity Fair by William Makepeace Thackeray, Chapter 59. The Old Piano. The Major's visit left old John Sedley in a great state of agitation and excitement. His daughter could not induce him to settle down to his customary occupations or amusements that night. He passed the evening fumbling amongst his boxes and desks, untying his papers with trembling hands, and sorting and arranging them against Joss's arrival. He had them in the greatest order, his tapes and his files, his receipts, and his letters with lawyers and correspondence. The documents relative to the wine project, which failed from a most unaccountable accident after commencing with the most splendid prospects. The coal project, which only a want of capital prevented from becoming the most successful scheme ever put before the public. The patent sawmills and sawdust consolidation product, etc., etc. All night, until a very late hour, he passed in the preparation of these documents, trembling about from one room to another, with a quivering candle and shaky hands. Here's the wine papers, here's the sawdust, here's the coals, here's my letters to Calcutta and Madras, and replies from Major Dobbin, C.B., and Mr. Joseph Sedley to the same. He shall find no irregularity about me, Emmy, the old gentleman said. Emmy smiled. I don't think Joss will care about seeing those papers, Papa, she said. You don't know anything about business, my dear, answered the sire, shaking his head with an important air. And it must be confessed that on this point Emmy was very ignorant, and that it is a pity some people are so knowing. All these twopenny documents arranged on a side table, old Sedley covered them carefully over with a clean bandana handkerchief, one out of Major Dobbin's lot, and enjoined the maid and landlady of the house in the most solemn way not to disturb those papers, which were arranged for the arrival of Mr. Joseph Sedley the next morning. Mr. Joseph Sedley of the Honourable East India Company's Bengal Civil Service. Amelia found him up very early the next morning, more eager, more hectic, and more shaky than ever. I didn't sleep much, Emmy, my dear, he said. I was thinking of my poor Bessie. I wish she was alive to ride in Joss's carriage once again. She kept her own, and became it very well. And his eyes filled with tears, which trickled down his furrowed old face. Amelia wiped them away, and smiling, kissed him, and tied the old man's neckcloth in a smart bow, and put his brooch into his best shirt frill, in which, in his Sunday suit of mourning, he sat from 6 o'clock in the morning, awaiting the arrival of his son. However, when the postman made his appearance, the little party was put out of suspense by the receipt of a letter from Joss to his sister, who announced that he felt a little fatigued after his voyage, and should not be able to move on that day, but that he would leave Southampton early the next morning, and be with his father and mother at evening. Amelia, as she read out the letter to her father, paused over the latter word. Her brother, it was clear, did not know what had happened in the family. Nor could he, for the fact is that though the Major rightly suspected that his travelling companion never would be got into motion in so short a space as 24 hours, and would find some excuse for delaying, yet Dobbin had not written to Joss to inform him of the calamity which had befallen the Sedley family, being occupied in talking with Amelia until long after post hour. There are some splendid tailor shops in the High Street of Southampton, in the fine plate-glass windows of which hang gorgeous waistcoats of all sorts, of silk and velvet, and gold and crimson, and pictures of the latest new fashions, in which those wonderful gentlemen with quizzing glasses, and holding on to little boys with the exceeding large eyes and curly hair, ogle ladies in riding habits prancing by the statue of Achilles at Apsley House. Joss, although provided with some of the most splendid vests that Calcutta could furnish, thought he could not go to town until he was supplied with one or two of these garments, and selected a crimson satin, embroidered with gold butterflies, and a black and red velvet tartan, with white stripes and a rolling collar, with which, and a rich blue satin stock and gold pin, consisting of a 5-barred gate, with a horseman in pink enamel jumping over it. He thought he might make his entry into London with some dignity. For Joss's former shyness and blundering, blushing timidity have given way to a more candid and courageous self-assertion of his worth. "I don't care about owning it," Waterloo Sedley would say to his friends. "I am a dressy man." And though rather uneasy if the ladies looked at him at the Government House balls, and though he blushed and turned away alarmed under their glances, it was chiefly from a dread lest they should make love to him that he avoided them, being averse to marriage altogether. But there was no such swell in Calcutta as Waterloo Sedley, I have heard say, and he had the handsomest turnout, gave the best bachelor dinners, and had the finest plate in the whole place. To make these waistcoats for a man of his size and dignity took at least a day, part of which he employed in hiring a servant to wait upon him and his native, and instructing the agent who cleared his baggage, his boxes, his books, which he never read, his chest of mangoes, chutney, and curry powders, his shawls for presents to people whom he didn't know as yet, and the rest of his persicose apparatus. At length he drove leisurely to London on the third day, and in the new waistcoat, the native with chattering teeth, shuddering in a shawl on the box by the side of the new European servant, Joss puffing his pipe at intervals within, and looking so majestic that the little boys cried hooray, and many people thought he must be a Governor-General. He, I promise, did not decline the obsequious invitation of the landlords to alight and refresh himself in the neat country towns. Having partaken of a copious breakfast with fish and rice and hard eggs at Southampton, he had so far rallied at Winchester as to think a glass of sherry necessary. At Acton he stepped out of the carriage at his servant's request, and imbibed some of the ale for which the place is famous. At Farnham he stopped to view the bishop's castle, and to partake of a light dinner of stewed eels, veal cutlets, and French beans, with a bottle of claret. He was cold over Bagshot Heath, where the native chattered more and more, and Joss Sahib took some brandy and water. In fact, when he drove into town he was as full of wine, beer, meat, pickles, cherry brandy, and tobacco as the steward's cabin of a steam packet. It was evening when his carriage thundered up to the little door in Brompton, whither the affectionate fellow drove first, and before hieing to the apartments secured for him by Mr. Dobbin at the Slaughters. All the faces in the street were in the windows. The little maidservant flew to the wicket-gate. The madame's clap looked out from the casement of the ornamented kitchen. Emmy, in a great flutter, was in the passage among the hats and coats, and old Sedley in the parlour inside, shaking all over. Joss descended from the post-chaise and down the creeping, swaying steps in awful state, supported by the new valet from Southampton and the shuddering native, whose brown face was now livid with cold and of the colour of a turkey's gizzard. He created an immense sensation in the passage presently, where Mrs. Clapp and Miss Clapp, coming perhaps to listen at the parlour door, found Lal Jiatwab shaking upon the hall bench under the coats, moaning in a strange, piteous way, and showing his yellow eyeballs and teeth. For you see, we have adroitly shut the door upon the meeting between Joss and the old father and the poor little gentle sister inside. The old man was very much affected, so of course was his daughter, nor was Joss without feeling. In that long absence of 10 years the most selfish will think about home and early ties. Distance sanctifies both. Long brooding over those lost pleasures exaggerates their charm and sweetness. Joss was unaffectedly glad to see and shake the hand of his father, between whom and himself there had been a coolness, glad to see his little sister, whom he remembered so pretty and smiling, and pained at the alteration which time, grief, and misfortune had made in the shattered old man. Emmy had come out to the door in her black clothes and whispered to him of her mother's death, and not to speak of it to their father. There was no need for this caution, for the elder Sedley himself began immediately to speak of the event, and prattled about it and wept over it piteously. It shocked the Indian not a little, and made him think of himself less than the poor fellow was accustomed to do. The result of the interview must have been very satisfactory, for when Joss reascended his post-chaise and had driven away to his hotel, Emmy embraced her father tenderly, appealing to him with an air of triumph, and asking the old man whether she did not always say that her brother had a good heart. Indeed, Joseph Sedley, affected by the humble position in which he found his relations, and in the expansiveness and overflowing of heart occasioned by their first meeting, declared that they should never suffer want or discomfort any more, that he was at home for some time at any rate, during which his house and everything he had should be theirs, and Amelia would look very pretty at the head of his table, until she would accept one of her own. She shook her head sadly, and had, as usual, recourse to the waterworks. She knew what he meant. She and her young confidante, Miss Mary, had talked over the matter most fully the very night of the Major's visit, beyond which time the impetuous Polly could not refrain from talking of the discovery which she had made, and describing the start and tremor of joy by which Major Dobbin betrayed himself when Mr. Binny passed with his bride, and the Major learned that he had no longer a rival to fear. "Didn't you see how he shook all over when you asked if he was married, and said, 'Who told you those lies?' Oh, ma'am," Polly said, "he never kept his eyes off of you, and I'm sure he's grown grey thinking of you." But Amelia, looking up at her bed, over which hung the portraits of her husband and son, told her young protégé never to speak on that subject again, that Major Dobbin had been her husband's dearest friend, and her own and George's most kind and affectionate guardian, that she loved him as a brother, but that a woman who had been married to such an angel as that, and she pointed to the wall, could never think of any other union. Poor Polly sighed. She thought what she should do if young Mr. Tompkins at the surgery, who always looked at her so at church, and who, by those mere aggressive glances, had put her timorous little heart into such a flutter that she was ready to surrender at once. What should she do if he were to die? She knew he was consumptive, his cheeks were so red, and he was uncommon thin in the waist. Not that Emmy, being made aware of the honest Major's passion, rebuffed him in any way, or felt displeased with him. Such an attachment from so true and loyal a gentleman could make no woman angry. Desdemona was not angry with Cassio, though there is very little doubt she saw the lieutenant's partiality for her, and I for my part believe there were many more things that took place in that sad affair than the worthy Moorish officer ever knew of. Why, Miranda was even very kind to Caliban, and we may be pretty sure for the same reason. Not that she would encourage him in the least, the poor uncouth monster, of course not. No more would Emmy by any means encourage her admirer, the Major. She would give him that friendly regard which so much excellence and fidelity merited. She would treat him with perfect cordiality and frankness until he made his proposals, and then it would be time enough for her to speak, and to put an end to hopes which could never be realized. She slept therefore very soundly that evening, after the conversation with Miss Polly, and was more than ordinarily happy, in spite of Joss's delaying. "I'm glad he's not going to marry that Miss O'Dowd," she thought. "Colonel O'Dowd never could have a sister fit for such an accomplished man as Major William. Who was there amongst her little circle who would make him a good wife? Not Miss Binny, she was too old and ill-tempered. Miss Osborne, too old too. Little Polly was too young. Mrs. Osborne could not find anybody to suit the Major before she went to sleep." The same morning brought Major Dobbin a letter to the Slaughters' coffee-house from his friend at Southampton, begging dear Dobb to excuse Joss for being in a rage when awakened the day before. He had a confounded headache and was just in his first sleep, and entreating Dobb to engage comfortable rooms at the Slaughters for Mr. Sedley and his servants. The Major had become necessary to Joss during the voyage. He was attached to him, and hung upon him. The other passengers were away to London. Young Ricketts and little Chaffers went away on the coach that day, Ricketts on the box, taking the reins from Botley. The doctor was off to his family at Portsea, Bragg gone to town with his co-partners, and the first mate busy in the unloading of the ram Chunder. Mr. Joe was very lonely at Southampton, and got the landlord of the George to take a glass of wine with him that day, at the very hour at which Major Dobbin was seated at the table of his father, Sir William, where his sister found out, for it was impossible for the Major to tell fibs, that he had been to see Mrs. George Osborne. Joss was so comfortably situated in St. Martin's Lane, he could enjoy his hookah there with such perfect ease, and could swagger down to the theatres when minded so agreeably, that perhaps he would have remained altogether at the Slaughters, had not his friend the Major been at his elbow. That gentleman would not let the Bengalee rest until he had executed his promise of having a home for Amelia and his father. Jos was a soft fellow in anybody's hands, Dobbin most active in anybody's concerns but his own. The civilian was, therefore, an easy victim to the guileless arts of this good-natured diplomatist, and was ready to purchase, hire, or relinquish whatever his friend thought fit. Lal Juab, of whom the boys about St. Martin's Lane used to make cruel fun whenever he showed his dusky countenance in the street, was sent back to Calcutta in the Lady Kicklebury East Indiaman, in which Sir William Dobbin had a share, having previously taught Jos's European the art of preparing curries, pilaus, and pipes. It was a matter of great delight and occupation to Jos to superintend the building of a small chariot which he and the Major ordered in the neighbouring Long Acre, and a pair of handsome horses were jobbed, with which Jos drove about in state in the park, or to call upon his Indian friends. Amelia was not seldom by his side on these excursions, when also Major Dobbin would be seen in the back seat of the carriage. At other times old Sedley and his daughter took advantage of it, and Miss Clapp, who frequently accompanied her friend, had great pleasure in being recognized as she sat in the carriage, dressed in the famous yellow shawl, by the young gentleman at the surgery, whose face might commonly be seen over the window blinds as she passed. Shortly after Jos's first appearance at Brompton, a dismal scene, indeed, took place at that humble cottage at which the Sedleys had passed the last 10 years of their life. Jos's carriage, the temporary one, not the chariot under construction, arrived one day and carried off old Sedley and his daughter to return no more. The tears that were shed by the landlady and the landlady's daughter at that event were as genuine tears of sorrow as any that have ever been outpoured in the course of history. In their long acquaintanceship and intimacy, they could not recall a harsh word that had been uttered by Amelia. She had been all sweetness and kindness, always thankful, always gentle, even when Mrs. Clapp lost her own temper and pressed for the rent. When the kind creature was going away for good and all, the landlady reproached herself bitterly for ever having used a rough expression to her. How she wept as they stuck up with wafers on the window a paper notifying that the little rooms so long occupied were to let. They never would have such lodgers again, and that was quite clear. Afterlife proved the truth of this melancholy prophecy, and Mrs. Clapp revenged herself for the deterioration of mankind by levying the most savage contributions upon the tea-caddies and legs of mutton of her locataires. Most of them scolded and grumbled. Some of them did not pay. None of them stayed. The landlady might well regret those old friends who had left her. As for Miss Mary, her sorrow at Amelia's departure was such as I shall not attempt to depict. From childhood upwards she had been with her daily, and had attached herself so passionately to that dear good lady, that when the grand barouche came to carry her off into splendour, she fainted in the arms of her friend, who was indeed scarcely less affected than the good-natured girl. Amelia loved her like a daughter. During 11 years the girl had been her constant friend and associate. Separation was a very painful one indeed to her, but it was of course arranged that Mary was to come and stay often at the grand new house whither Mrs. Osborne was going, and where Mary was sure she would never be so happy as she had been in their humble cot, as Miss Clapp called it, in the language of the novels which she loved. Let us hope she was wrong in her judgment. Poor Emmy's days of happiness had been very few in that humble cot. A gloomy fate had oppressed her there. She never liked to come back to the house after she had left it, or to face the landlady who had tyrannized over her when ill-humoured and unpaid, or when pleased had treated her with a coarse familiarity scarcely less odious. Her civility and fulsome compliments when Emmy was in prosperity were not more to the lady's liking. She cast about notes of admiration all over the new house, extolling every article of furniture or ornament. She fingered Mrs. Osborne's dresses and calculated their price. Nothing could be too good for that sweet lady, she vowed and protested. But in the vulgar sycophant who had now paid court to her, Emmy was always remembered the coarse tyrant who had made her miserable many a time, to whom she had been forced to put up petitions for time, when the rent was overdue, who cried out at her extravagance if she bought delicacies for her ailing mother or father, who had seen her humble and trampled upon her. Nobody ever heard of these griefs, which had been part of our poor little woman's lot in life. She kept them secret from her father, whose improvidence was the cause of much of her misery. She had to bear all the blame of his misdoings, and indeed was so utterly gentle and humble as to be made by nature for a victim. I hope she is not to suffer much more of that hard usage, and, as in all griefs there is said to be some consolation, I may mention that poor Mary, when left at her friend's departure in a hysterical condition, was placed under the medical treatment of the young fellow from the surgery, under whose care she rallied after a short period. Emmy, when she went away from Brompton, endowed Mary with every article of furniture that house contained, only taking away her pictures, the 2 pictures over the bed, and her piano, that little piano which had now passed into a plaintive jingling old age, but which she loved for reasons of her own. She was a child when first she played on it, and her parents gave it her. It had been given to her again since, as the reader may remember, when her father's house was gone to ruin, and the instrument was recovered out of the wreck. Major Dobbin was exceedingly pleased when, as he was superintending the arrangements of Joss's new house, which the Major insisted should be very handsome and comfortable, the cart arrived from Brompton, bringing the trucks and bandboxes of the immigrants from that village, and with them the old piano. Amelia would have it up in her sitting-room, a neat little apartment on the 2nd floor, adjoining her father's chamber, and where the old gentleman sat commonly of evenings. When the men appeared bearing this old music-box, and Amelia gave orders that it should be placed in the chamber aforesaid, Dobbin was quite elated. "I'm glad you've kept it," he said in a very sentimental manner. "I was afraid you didn't care about it." "I value it more than anything I have in the world," said Amelia. "Do you, Amelia?" cried the Major. The fact was, as he had bought it himself, though he never said anything about it, it never entered into his head to suppose that Emmy should think anybody else was the purchaser, and as a matter of course he fancied that she knew the gift came from him. "Do you, Amelia?" he said, and the question, the great question of all, was trembling on his lips, when Emmy replied, "Can I do otherwise? Did not he give it to me?" "I did not know," said poor old Dobb, and his countenance fell. Emmy did not note the circumstances at the time, nor take immediate heed of the very dismal expression which honest Dobbin's countenance assumed, but she thought of it afterwards, and then it struck her, with inexpressible pain and mortification too, that it was William who was the giver of the piano, and not George, as she had fancied. It was not George's gift, the only one which she had received from her lover, as she thought. The thing she had cherished beyond all others, her dearest relic and prize. She had spoken to it about George, played his favourite airs upon it, sat for long evening hours, touching, to the best of her simple art, melancholy harmonies on the keys, and weeping over them in silence. It was not George's relic. It was valueless now. The next time that old Sedley asked her to play, she said it was shockingly out of tune, that she had a headache, that she couldn't play. Then, according to her custom, she rebuked herself for her pettishness and ingratitude, and determined to make a reparation to honest William for the slight she had not expressed to him, but had felt for his piano. A few days afterwards, as they were seated in the drawing-room, where Joss had fallen asleep with great comfort after dinner, Amelia said with rather a faltering voice to Major Dobbin, "I have to beg your pardon for something." "About what?" said he. About that little square piano. I never thanked you for it when you gave it me, many, many years ago, before I was married. I thought someone else had given it. But thank you, William." She held out her hand, but the poor little woman's heart was bleeding, and as for her eyes, of course they were at their work. But William could hold no more. "Amelia, Amelia," he said, "I did buy it for you. I loved you then as I do now, I must tell you. I think I loved you from the first minute that I saw you, when George brought me to your house to show me the Amelia whom he was engaged to. You were but a girl, in white, with large ringlets. You came down singing, do you remember? And we went to Vauxhall. Since then I have thought of but one woman in the world, and that was you. I think there is no hour in the day that has passed for 12 years that I haven't thought of you. I came to tell you this before I went to India, but you did not care, and I hadn't the heart to speak. You did not care whether I stayed or went." "I was very ungrateful," Amelia said. "No, only indifferent," Dobbin continued desperately. "I have nothing to make a woman be otherwise. I know what you are feeling now. You're hurt in your heart at the discovery about the piano, and that it came from me and not from George. I forgot, or I should never have spoken of it so. It is for me to ask your pardon for being a fool for a moment, and thinking that years of constancy and devotion might have pleaded with you." "It is you who are cruel now," Amelia said with some spirit. "George is my husband here and in heaven. How could I love any other but him? I am his now as when you first saw me, dear William. It was he who told me how good and generous you were, and who taught me to love you as a brother. Have you not been everything to me and my boy? Our dearest, truest, kindest friend and protector. Had you come a few months sooner, perhaps you might have spared me that dreadful parting. It nearly killed me, William. But you didn't come, and though I wished and prayed for you to come, and they took him too, away from me. Isn't he a noble boy, William? Be his friend still, and mine." And here her voice broke, and she hid her face on his shoulder. The Major folded his arms around her, holding her to him as if she was a child, and kissed her head. "I will not change, dear Amelia," he said. "I ask for no more than your love. I think I would not have it otherwise. Only let me stay near you and see you often." "Yes, often," Amelia said. And so William was at liberty to look and to long, as the poor boy at school who has no money may sigh after the contents of the tart woman's tray. End of chapter 59.